Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for this video, I'm going to be discussing exceptions to the rules. And what do I mean by that? I mean that usually, these aren't like hard, fast rules, but like usually for books, I'll try to stay away from certain maybe genres or topics or settings or just things that normally I don't love in books. I'll maybe try to avoid those if I know the book has that in it. But in life in general, not just in books, but just in life in general, there's always exceptions to the rules, right? Like you feel one way, or like maybe you don't like one type of movie, but then there's that one movie that's kind of the rare exception, or maybe like food. Like I normally don't like this type of food, but like I love this kind of food. Like there's always exceptions to the rules, and maybe an example for books because we're gonna be talking about books here. Very popular one would be like, oh, I don't really love classic fantasy, but of course I love Lord of the Rings, which is a classic exception to the rule for most people. I do love the movies. I don't love the books. But for this video, I've got probably a little less than 10 rules I'm going to talk about, but also 10 exceptions to the rules. I don't know what the number is, but I've got some exceptions to the rules. We're going to go over them. And before that, comment down below what are some exceptions to the rules for you. Like what are some, like not hard and fast rules, but like generally, like you don't like this type of book or this type of setting or genre, but here's one example that's an exception to the rule. So comment that down below. But for right now, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So counting here, I have 8, not 10. Maybe I'll think of some more as I'm filming, but I don't know. The first one, I'll just go in random order. Generally, I don't love older sci-fi. I have found some older fantasy that I like, but generally, like older sci-fi is really hard for me to get into because a lot of it is very mugged down and like the scientific detail and the questioning of everything and the philosophy of the scientific whatever. But for me, the reason I like to read books is more because of the characters and the plot. A lot of like classic sci-fi that I've tried to read just a lot of the times doesn't have either of those. It's kind of just like, okay, here's some characters and like here's some like a basic premise, but it's just like pondering of like what the implications of all this stuff is, and like I don't care about any of that. Like, I've read, like Arthur C. Clarke. I've read, who else? Ursula K. Le Guin and other, older sci-fi authors like that. And I just can't get into it for whatever reason. Mainly, like I said, lack of character development, good characters, and lack of a moving and interesting plot. But for me, a clear exception to the rule, and maybe I'll come up with 2 here. One of them is definitely George R.R. Martin. His older sci-fi, and a lot of people don't even know that he has stuff besides A Song of Ice and Fire. His old sci-fi is what propelled him to become my #1 favorite author, to dethrone Stephen King himself. Like A Song of Ice and Fire is my favorite series of all time, favorite fantasy series. But his older stuff, like his just like 70s and 80s sci-fi / horror stuff is so good. And Night Flyers is a clear example, just one of the weirdest out there sci-fi things I've ever read. But what stands out for me is that he has these kind of weird sci-fi stuff going on, but at the heart of it, it's really with the characters. And that's what I look forward to most in books. So for him to like take sci-fi and kind of have that weird philosophizing of all this weird scientific stuff, but to in the heart of it to have really great characters, perfect blend, love it. And he's written a ton of great sci-fi stuff, including Night Flyer. So that's one example. Another one kind of is Michael Crichton. You could argue that he's more of like a sci-fi thriller author, but he writes his books in a way that, like, his characters aren't necessarily the best, but the plots are very fast moving. The premises are all really cool, and he does have scientific jargon like in the books, but the way that he writes it is just kind of very accessible and interesting and intriguing, and you get that fast moving plot. So the way that he writes is also very compelling. But for me, definitely my favorite sci-fi author would actually have to be George R. R. Martin. Another kind of loose rule that I have is that typically I've found I don't like fantasy series and books that take place in school settings. I've read a bunch of them, or I've DNF'd a lot of them that I just can't get into. Like I just, for whatever reason, I don't like it. One of them, a very popular one, would be Name of the Wind. I actually really love like the first couple of 100 pages of that before Quoth gets to the university, but once he gets there, the story kind of just falls flat for me. So that's a kind of a perfect example of like a book that has like preschool and then a school setting. I loved the first part of it, but then after that, when it gets to the school, couldn't really care. And there's other examples, but there are definitely exceptions to the rule. Of course, you know, Harry Potter is a clear one, but I feel like even for people who don't like that, like Harry Potter was a big part of their childhood, so that might be cheating a little bit. But definitely a clear example for me that is an exception to the rule is Poppy War. Now, Poppy War, not all of the series takes place in the school, and not even all in the first book, but I would say like the first half of it, Ren is definitely at a school setting, and I really liked it. Mainly though because of Ren. I know a lot of people have frustrations with her, but I think that's one of the more compelling aspects of her character is that she is frustrating to read about. And yeah, half of this book is at a school setting, and the other half is basically war. So I think that works, that the whole series isn't necessarily in a school setting, but like Poppy War, school setting worked really well for me. And also Harry Potter, but like, duh. Another rule, this one's kind of more hard in place because I've just had so many examples of books that this just really irks me. And that's reading books with extremely short chapters. I'm more on the mindset that like medium paced chapters or medium length chapters are kind of perfect because you get a good balance of character and plot that way. Super long chapters I don't like either because it's just filled with, you know, extraneous information and just too much detail at times. Like sometimes Stephen King has really long chapters and it's just too much. Or, you know, even like Malazan. God, those books are like 1,000 pages, but it'll only have like 20 chapters, like 50, 100 page. No, that's too much. Too much. But then the opposite, really short chapters, I've felt that you just don't get enough of the characters. Like usually when you have like really short chapters, it's like all plot. Like you're just moving from one event to the other without kind of taking the time to breathe and to be in the minds of the characters. So really short chapters can really get on my nerves. And if I flip through a book and it has really short chapters, I'm less likely to want to pick it up. But there is a clear example of when short chapters, I think, actually worked well for the book. And one of my favorite horror books that uses this well is The Grip of It by Jacques Jemk. A very weird cover, if you couldn't tell. But yeah, this book is probably the creepiest book I've ever read. The scariest one is probably Misery by Stephen King. That book, you know, is very scary. But this one is a haunted house tale, extremely creepy. It is very short. It's less than 300 pages, but it has, I think, about 90 or 100 chapters in it. And like I said, normally that does not work well for me, but I think it works well here because you're constantly switching back and forth between the husband and the wife's POV, and they're in this haunted house scenario, and, you know, they have kind of differing things happening to them, and sometimes, you know, they're conflicted with each other and weird, you know, it just works really well because it is kind of a fever dream, and like getting constantly switching back and forth between their things and trying to figure out and piece together what's going on, I think adds to the suspense and the creepiness factor here. So in this instance, it works really well, and it is definitely an exception to the rule. But mostly, I like medium length chapters. And this one's not necessarily a rule necessarily, but I often don't love magical realism books. I've tried them, and a lot of the times they're just, I don't know, I just can't really get that interested. They're kind of boring. They don't have that wow factor to them that make me like just really want to continue and devour the book. Like they're good, and oftentimes the writing is good, but you know, it just doesn't have that wow factor for me. But a clear exception to this rule, where obviously this author is like by far my favorite author who writes magical realism, is Haruki Murakami. Almost all of his books kind of have a magical realism aspect to them. Some of them that don't are often like my least favorite by him. But this one for sure, Hardboiled Wonderland, and a lot of other ones that have just really stuck with me, do have that kind of weird element to them, the magical realism. And his books, I would definitely classify it as like weird fiction, where like it's just weird. It's like really got to read it to figure out what that means. But like, and again, magical realism is definitely not a favorite genre for me, but Haruki Murakami, clear example of an author who can write magical realism and have me enjoy it. Also, you know, like a one-off would be like Piranesi. I would describe that as magical realism, and that book is one of my favorite books of all time. So, clear exception to the rule, but yeah, Haruki Murakami, definite exception to the rule. Another kind of subgenre of fantasy that I found I just don't love that much, and it's really hard for me to find a series where I love it, is assassin fantasy. I've tried several of them, and for whatever reason, like I just can't get into it. I've tried like Red Sister by Mark Lawrence, couldn't get into that. And I DNF'd Brent Weeks' The Night Angel trilogy. Like a lot of that's assassin stuff. I couldn't really get into that. And there's some other ones. Like I've tried several assassin stuff, and for whatever reason, I just can't get into it. But this series is not only like definitely my favorite assassin fantasy series, but it's also definitely in my top 10 fantasy series of all time. And that would, of course, be the Song of Shattered Sands series by Bradley P. Bulio, starting, of course, with 12 Kings and Cherokee. We have the main character of Cheda, and she's an assassin, and there's a lot of other assassin-like characters. And yeah, this is one of my all-time favorites. Such a unique fantasy setting and characters, and it happens to be an assassin fantasy. So definitely my favorite, and definitely an exception to the rule. So this next rule is basically, it's pretty simple. I don't really love vampires that much. And I've tried reading several vampire stuff, and for the most part, I just think it's kind of a tired horror trope. I'm just not the biggest fan of vampires. Pretty simple. Like I love horror, and I do love when horror can kind of have like weird creatures, but like vampires for me just aren't as compelling as a lot of other horror genres. But there are two clear examples, like really the only two that I can think of ever, that I've like really enjoyed. My favorite vampire novel of all time is, yet again, George coming up, Fever Dream by George R. R. Martin. Definitely my favorite vampire novel of all time. This one is pretty unique in that it takes place on a steamboat in the Mississippi River in the 1800s, and I don't want to give too much away, but yeah, it's George's take on vampires. It's really good. It was written, I believe, in the early 80s, and yeah, so far this is by far definitely my favorite vampire novel. There's also Salem's Lot by Stephen King, which is pretty good. Not one of my all-time favorite King novels. It is one of his most famous ones, though. A lot of people cite that as one of his best horror books and one of his scariest books, but for me, it's pretty good. But yeah, definitely Fever Dream is the clear exception to the rule here, because normally I just don't care about vampires, but George made me interested, and yeah, it really paid off. And also generally, you know, especially now as a 31-year-old man, I'm not that into middle grade. Sometimes middle grade can work, but oftentimes it's either kind of just good, or like even if it is good, like it can be forgettable. But for me, a middle grade author that I still love to this day. I read, back when I was actually in middle school, but I still love his books to this day, is Jordan Sonnenblick, of course, author of Drums, Girls, and Dangerous Pie. I read this when I was in like 6th or 7th grade, and then this is probably my most reread book. I still enjoy this book as an adult, and I've read almost everything he's written, and I think they hold up well as an adult because he's not afraid to talk about very serious topics in his middle grade books, so they can be hard hitting at times, especially for middle grade. So yeah, I typically don't love middle grade books. I do want to try to go back and read some. Like, me and Ian have a plan of going back to read the Redwall books, and I think those were probably like middle grade YA books. And yeah, I want to try to read those. Hopefully they stand the test of time. But for me, Jordan Sonnenblick is the clear exception to this rule, because sometimes, middle grade books, they're fine, but Jordan Sonnenblick books I love. And the last rule that I'll talk about here is generally I don't love romance books, or, when authors attempt to write romance, because a lot of my favorite authors, they're not the best at romance. Like Stephen King, he can be, but a lot of the times it's not the most important aspect of the book. And then Brandon Sanderson, not very good with romance. Even George R. R. Martin, my favorite author of all time, it's not really his cup of tea. But generally, like, I don't go and pick up, like, I don't go to the romance section of bookstores. But there is one author that has written books with romance and books that are basically just romance books that I really love, and she's one of my favorite authors of all time, which is surprising, but also not that surprising, and I'll get into why that is. But Taylor Jenkins Reid, the clear exception to the rule here. She does, like, I would say, like, all of her books have a romance aspect to them. Not all of them are, like, especially about the romance. Like, Daisy Jones and the Six is more about band drama and music and dealing with all that stuff. There is romance, but band drama, really good stuff, and music in general. But some of her books, like this one, Maybe in Another Life, it does have a lot of, like, it's basically about this woman, and, it's got kind of a weird sci-fi element, actually, because you get both stories of, like, she makes this decision, and you get the story of, like, whether she makes this decision or whether she makes this other decision, and you get her life, her path of, like, how her life would end up on both directions. But a lot of it deals with romance. So I just think she's a really good writer. I love the way she writes her characters and her dialogue. And yeah, so she does write really good romance stuff. So clear exception to the rule here. All right, so those are some exceptions to the rules for me. Definitely let me know what you think of my exceptions to the rules. Also, comment down below if there's any rules that you have that have some exceptions. Also, for all of these rules that I have, let me know if you think there's any authors or books or series that could also be exceptions to these rules. So recommend me some books that could potentially break some of these rules for me. Comment all of that down below. And yeah, that's all I got for you today. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, like the video and hit thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Stay subscribed for more content. I try to post every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And what else do I say? Patreon link down below if you want to go support me there for as little as $1 a month. Also link down below, Bookish Tournament Discord, where we've got tons of buddy reads and read-alongs happening all the damn time. And Amazon wishlist if you'd like to buy me a book. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have a fantastic day.